Hi there, Read 536. This is Dr. Keisler, and I wanted to just spend a minute or two responding to something I read in the Week 6 discussion board as I was just grading them this morning. So there was a very interesting thread started by Patricia and continued by many other students. And it addressed, essentially, Patricia brought into question the finding of the 30 million word gap by Hart and Risley. So this is a really interesting thread, and what I like about it is it really shows that we're engaged in the material. And I always agree that we should question what's put in front of us, and I think that this group in particular is really going to enjoy our venture later in the semester into questioning the findings of the report of the National Reading Panel, and many of the what I would consider detrimental policies that came into play as a result of that report and reports like that. So I would, though, like to make a few points, since many students were engaged in that thread, with, of course, the acknowledgement that, of course, I'm not trying to tell anyone at all how they should think or what they should believe. In fact, I'm a well-known skeptic myself, but there were a few points that I would like to clarify. So the discussion really centered around this idea of Hart and Risley's work and the 30 million word gap and the idea of deficit models. So deficit models of education, and you probably learned a lot about them in 514, really came into play during the era in which Hart and Risley did their initial research, which, as stated in the thread, was over 50 years ago. And so the response that we will learn in a few weeks was this era of compensatory education that happened during President Johnson's Great Society, right, as part of that. And like I said, we'll go into this in much more detail in a few weeks. So, of course, back then, work such as Hart and Risley's were not widely viewed as deficit models, and this term, kind of gradually came into position as the results of compensatory education and labeling and classifying students unfolded. And you can see kind of the view or the results of these deficit models when we think about research, education, or programming that's geared towards specific groups. So that's geared to solve a problem that's evident in the education of African American students to, and I'm using finger quotes here, solve a problem that's been, discovered or researched in the education of students with learning differences. Students who speak other languages, students who are poor, right? Students of poverty. So all of these models have been termed deficit models by those who in turn study and research the idea of deficit models themselves. So kind of at the heart of what we might term a deficit model is the notion that the gap or the deficit or the disability or the thing that's wrong lies within the individual. So in our case, it lies within the child, as opposed to being a problem with the system. So to use an analogy, a square peg, right? So you can't get it into a round hole. So do we fault the peg for being square and try to sand it or shave it or shove it, into that hole or modify it in some way so that it can fit into that hole? Or do we look at the hole itself and think maybe that hole shouldn't be so round to begin with, and that indeed there is nothing wrong with that square peg? So that's kind of at the heart, very simply, of what a deficit model is. It says that there's something wrong or off about that peg that needs to be fixed. And so in our case, that peg would be a child or a group of children. So this debate itself is really at the core of school reform, as you probably already know, as we'll talk about in this class and as you'll talk about in others. Although this class is the class in which we really dig into reform and these kind of issues the most, this in 514. So, is our system supposed to mold and train and produce a certain type of individual that is supposed to be a certain way? Or is our system somehow broken in that it can't accommodate for so many differences and still produce quote unquote success? So if the problem is with the system, how do we fix it, right? And on another note, how do we define success at this point? So these are the questions at the heart of all these debates, as you have identified in this thread. So then there was a section there that did question the findings of the research itself. And so while it is true that the initial study was done about 50 years ago, the original study was indeed that. It was an initial finding, right? So Hart and Risley and many others have expanded upon this work over the decades, and the studies have expanded to include not just that original sample of the 42 African American families, but many, many more students and from a much more diverse pool. But, yes, at the end of the day, you could say that these students are still being judged on a rubric that's representative of, the American standard, based on English, based on middle class, predominantly white values, as is, I would argue, our economy and society, much of society as a whole, still in the modern day. So I wanted to make this point because we have not, or all of this research or the work that's come after it is not all centered on this one study that they did in the beginning, right? So this work has been continued not just by them, but by others. And so if that's not to say there's not a fault in the research, but the fault would be in the approach, right? So the fault would be in continuing to look at differences in word knowledge in the way that they have, right? But they have, and others have continued to look at this. So the sample is wide, and it is varied. So, and yet they published in books, but they also have published these studies in peer-reviewed journals, right? So the Education Review, which was the one that was questioned, is indeed a peer-reviewed education journal. You probably, when you Googled and you found out that it was a journal of book reviews, that's not the publication that it was from. It's the Education Review is actually out of the UK, which is why it didn't pop up on Google. So it's considered an international journal. So they've also published in American Educator and Developmental Psychology. So these are also peer-reviewed journals. But yes, they have put much of their work in books, and I don't know why they chose to do that. So finally, in my final response to this thread, there was a section that, questioned research. And so I think it's important to note that article from The Atlantic, and I'm a huge fan of The Atlantic. I'm a subscriber. I read it every month. That's primarily concerned with medical research. So it's not to say that there are not issues with collecting data and in publishing the findings in education research, but as you surely are going to study when you take Read 511, those of you that are getting the full degree, social science research is really its own beast. So especially in education, we fully acknowledge that it's difficult to prove anything, and in fact, we very rarely use use language that refers to proving anything. We even shy away from causality many times. But because we're dealing with children, right? We're not dealing with widgets, and we're not dealing in laboratories. We're dealing with people and families, and we're looking at not just, if I do, A to this subject in this controlled environment, do I get the result of B or C? You can't do that in education. There's no such thing as a controlled environment, right? So we don't have, it's not to say that we don't have the same standards, but it's rare that, we do randomized trials the way that they get to do in medical research. It's really rare that we have a true control group because we have so many things that come into play when we're studying people and we're studying kids. So it just doesn't happen. And, nor does the nature of our work really require it in the same way that it does in medical research. So, while it's healthy, of course, to question, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, as they say, and believe that all of the research that you're going to read is invalid or can easily be debunked. So, in my humble opinion, comparing medical research to education research is kind of like comparing apples to oranges, right? So, and this is one of the reasons it's taken so long for qualitative research or education research in general to get the respect that it deserves or to be actually considered real research. So, yeah, I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about that since so many students were engaged, and I really did enjoy reading it. So if you haven't read it yet, I encourage you to do so. But like I said in the beginning, I think that this class is really going to enjoy the next couple of weeks after we wrap up our discussion of Common Core, where we dive into the reform piece, and it really brings into question a lot of the points that were made here. So thank you for posting that, all of you that posted on it, and keep up the good work.